You've heard the one about the kid and his father who went to church and he saw the pastor up there fold his hands and bow his head. And the kid said, "Dad, what does that mean?" Well, that means we're preparing to honor God and pray to our God. And then a couple of minutes later, the kid notices that board with the hymn numbers on it. And he says, "Dad, what does that mean?" Well, those are the numbers of the hymns that we're going to sing today. That's just the way we tell each other how that's going to happen. And the preacher goes up to the pulpit to preach his sermon and takes off his watch and lays it on the side. And the kid says, "Dad, what does that mean?" Father says, "Not a damn thing." Well, what's that about? I mean, if you haven't heard that joke, you've certainly heard a lot of jokes like it. People just joke about sermons, how long they are, how boring they are. One wonders, though, if the court jester isn't trying to tell the king the truth. Isn't what that is all about, those jokes that come at us? It worries me. Now, there are things I suppose we could do about it. We could borrow from the Buddhists. You know, they've got some interesting ideas as to how to keep people in line. Remember Rafiki and the Lion King? That was a Zen stick he hit Simba over the head with. And I suppose if people nod off during our sermons, we could employ the use of a Zen stick. But I'm thinking that's probably not going to work. People are going to leave the church, as they've been doing anyway. But there is something deeply wrong with the fact that people are joking about sermons, because there is outrageous pain in the world. And we are preaching a gospel of outrageous love, the kind of love that can transform human hearts and move creation forward. And they're making jokes about how boring the sermons are. There's something wrong with that. And the thing is, I think we can do something about it. That's what I'm trying to do anyway. I think we can do something about it. There's a lot of bad preaching in the church. And I think it's time that we started to train ourselves again to become good preachers. I really believe that most pastors can become good preachers, not necessarily great preachers. Sometimes I think that great preaching is the enemy of good preaching. It's like, every pastor I know has a little dance of ego and commitment to the message going on, And inevitably, if we start comparing ourselves to other people, sometimes it drains our energy. We, get confused as to the direction we're going. We don't put the kind of time we might need. I think sometimes we just leave the great preaching to great preachers and let ourselves go. But that's not good for people, because there's outrageous pain in the world, and we have something to say that can feed people, that can open their hearts and transform their lives. We need to do some good preaching. Some good preaching. So what is good preaching? We're not very good, I find, at telling ourselves that we're good at what we do. I teach preaching at San Francisco Theological Seminary, have been for the last 12 years. And anytime one of my students preaches a sermon, and I don't care how bad it is, the first thing I want to hear from them is, what did you like about the sermon? You'd be amazed at how hard it is for them to do that. Generally, I ask them what was good about the sermon, and they tell me what was bad about the sermon before they ever mention anything good. We have a way of tearing ourselves down, but let's look at the things that we do that are good. What's good preaching, and what part of your preaching might be good? Regardless of what view you may take on the authority of Scripture, or how the Scriptures were formed and put together, I think we can certainly say that the Scriptures are the locus of a conversation that forms the theological mind and heart of believers. Right? I think, in fact, they were formed by that kind of a conversation over periods of history, reacting to the things that happened to the people of Israel. Those scriptures were developed and edited and redone and put together in different ways, all part of a large theological conversation that formed the theological mind and heart of the people. And to me, when you stand up or I stand up and preach a sermon, we're saying the next word in that conversation. That's what we're doing. And I'm expecting a word back. It's part of the way people are formed. We are in the process of forming the theological minds and hearts of a congregation in a time when the world is in outrageous pain. That's our job. We're not there to entertain. We're not there to be brilliant with extremely wonderful metaphors, and all those things are good, but that's not why we're there. We are there to allow the scriptures to be the locus of conversation, to form the theological mind and heart of a congregation. You want to know if you're a good preacher, then what you need to do is look at the congregation after you've been there for a few years. Have they grown? That's our goal. Have they grown? Have they developed? Has the conversation that you've had with them done something to form their faith so that it can sustain them in a world of outrageous pain? Now, there are things that go into being a good preacher. It's not rocket science. Homileticians have a whole variety of ways of looking at it, different things that you need to do to get a message across. And I happen to have 5 that I look at, but that's just my system. But I'll tell you the number one thing that I see keeps preachers from getting their message across. The number one thing that keeps the message from reaching the hearts and minds of the people so that it has any chance to form them. And that's form. The sermon form, whether or not the sermon is put together in a way that can move a heart, that can move a mind. A sermon that's in good form, it's the difference between whether or not, as my sister-in-law Jana puts it, it dribbling off the front of the pulpit and having it form a puddle on the ground, or whether it gets clearly and directly to the people in front of you. Or if you happen to be a loud, bombastic preacher, it's the difference between whether it spews out into the world or whether or not it reaches out into the world and changes the hearts and minds of people. Good form. And that's, for some people, a new notion. I mean, homileticians have been talking about this, since the time of Aristotle. But, how do we form a sermon so that the message gets across, so that we can form the theological minds and hearts of people in conversation with the Spirit in the text? I mean, how do we go about that? What forms would work? So let me give you 3 examples. There are many, many, many examples. My personal favorite is something called the Lowry Loop. Right? After Eugene Lowry, a homiletician of the last generation. And I call this the sitcom form because, in a sense, the sermon is shaped the way any plot of a sitcom would be shaped. Now, Lowry's PhD students took the moves of his sermons, step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and gave them names that are kind of memorable. So I'll just use those nicknames for the moves and describe this form. But before I describe it, let me just say when I'd use it. When I feel like there's a congregation that where there are people that are hurting, where there's something going on in their hearts, something that's disturbing in the world around them, where they need to know and even experience the presence and the love of God, well, then I might use this form. You begin with what the PhD students called oops. So you just lay out what a problem might be, that we have a lot of sorrow and grief in our world, disturbed by terrorist activities. There are any number of things. It really kind of depends on where you are and what's happening. So that's your oops. And then we go to ugh. And the ugh really unfolds that horror, that fear, all the stuff that comes from that. It even might begin to touch on the shame that people feel in a world of outrageous pain. Though I'd be careful about that. When we open up the moment of shame in people's lives, it's powerful and it can react. But once we've done that ugh, we offer an aha. But the world is not. It's not a place that's completely distorted, where we live in shame. Because the reality is, and we would get this from the text, and I'm just sort of doing this generically, the reality is that our being in the presence of Christ is the being of love and beauty. So we're not that ugly, shameful thing that we look at. And that's the good news. And so that's the aha. And then we move to we. And we is, well, let's imagine what it's like to live with that kind of a hope, with the recognition that you are an expression of the love of God. And so we describe how that might look, and it should balance, the ugh as it went down, and it should answer many of the things that the ugh said on the way down, so that we're lifting the heart as we go. And we come up the other side until we move to the yeah. And so let's celebrate the fact that the love of God lives within you and can be expressed through you. That's the Lowry loop. Oops, ugh, aha, we, yeah. Now I have a little Moodle class on my site that can help you take a look at a few sermons that have been preached using this form. And that may help to give you a sense of how that might work in your preaching. Same is true of the two other forms. I have this little course online that can help you figure this stuff out. The next one, kind of a personal favorite of mine, it comes from Madison Avenue. It's called Monroe's Motivated Sequence, and I call it the used car salesman sermon form. And, it can certainly be used as a manipulative form. That's how used car salesmen use it. But if it's used with integrity, it opens up the mind to a new and a fresh commitment. I think that's what Monroe's does. So you begin by establishing some contact, something that you have in common with your congregation. So are you like me? Are you concerned by the nonsense that we see all around us? So on and so forth. And then you begin to describe, well, what we would need as we, contend with this difficulty all around us. What we would need is something like the power and the strength of God to operate. Well, as it happens, we have that. See, we move from identifying what it is that we need, having discussed what our problem is, we identify what we need, and then we say that we have it. We can offer this gospel because here it is right in front of us within the text. So we offer the gospel and tell them what the hope of the love of God is. And then we say, and this is key for Monroe's Motivated Sequence, I want you to imagine what it's like to live like this. To live with the knowledge that you are able to address the nonsense in the world because you have a clarity of vision that allows you to know the love of God. And then finally, you get person to commit, to sign on the dotted line, to buy the sports car or whatever, but actually what you're doing is asking them to commit to living a life that is structured by the love of God, that allows us to move into the world and change the world. Monroe's Motivated Sequence. And the last one I'll do here, and as I say, there are many, many others, but these are forms that allow a sermon message to get out there without confusion. There's a great deal of power in them. So another one would be the New Hearing form. And I think this one is really useful because our understanding of theology has changed a lot of late. And so there's an opportunity to use this form at a moment like that when you see a shift. So you begin by talking about the old way we looked at something. And then you move into how that may not work now, that it may have some problems attached with it that we should address. So we do the old way and then we take it apart. And then we move to the new way, to a new way to looking at whatever it is we've been talking about, a new doctrine. I've been doing that a lot with the Trinity of late. When I think about the Trinity as the three faces of God, the three relationships we have, an I am, an I thou, and an I it. It's a new hearing way of dealing with the Trinity. So those are just three forms, gives you a sense. And that using a form and using it effectively is the difference between letting your message get across and letting it just fall off onto the floor where people just make jokes about it, or they snore, or they do whatever it is they do. They are not paying attention to a word that can give them great hope, though. Obviously, it's not all about form, though. If you're going to be a good preacher, you need a message that is going to emerge from your life, a message that's formed you so that you can help to form the theological mind and heart of the people in the pews. And there are some important things that goes into that. We need to have a sense of spiritual formation. I mean, if we're not connecting to the spirit that is driving this forward, well, then we may be in a conversation, but we're not in that conversation. And so I try and focus on spiritual formation, if that's what's going on in a preacher's life. What is it that's going to increase that sense of connection to the presence of God? And then there's the treasure hunt, the weekly treasure hunt, I call it, when we go into the scriptures and we dig far to find something that speaks to us in them. This is where I find it just disturbing when a lot of preachers just go out and read some sort of a magazine where somebody gives them the idea that sounds a little good. It's not something at that point that has formed you, that's changed you, so you can't speak to it in quite that way as you're preaching. It doesn't have the same sort of power. So we go on this weekly treasure hunt, and we were all taught how to do this in seminary, word studies and parallel passages and rhetorical analysis and all those things, but it's a treasure hunt. It's an opportunity to find a word. And once we've found it, one of the things that I try and do is ask myself, well, how do I take that one step deeper? And often that's when the Spirit of God begins to work on my life. Because we need a message that forms us so that we can be about the business of forming the theological mind and heart of a congregation. Now, I can help with this. It's what I want to do. Sure, I'm trying to make a living. I understand that. I want to make a living, but I want to make a living doing this because I'd like to make a difference in the American pulpit. That may seem like a big thing, but I think that we have a lot of people out there who can become good preachers, who are not being good preachers now, and I would love to help them do that. That's why I'm pulling this together. There's some resources on my site, this self-led Moodle course on form. It's not much, it's just a few little exercises. I hope that helps you. I mean, it's out there because I'd like it to help your preaching improve so that you can be a good preacher and offer love in a world with outrageous pain. Sometimes it doesn't take real long to begin to refocus your preaching and move it up to that good place, that good level. But there's so much bad preaching in the world that it just seems to me that it's incumbent upon us, when we look out on the people that are in our care, it's incumbent upon us to offer them the very best we have, that which has formed us and given us hope as the conversation around the scriptures goes on, next word after next word.